Hey guys, I wanted to talk today about OTK decks and kind of why they're very popular and sort of they're very controversial. I know I put my LTK Warlock video out, and some people were happy to see LTK and some people were not. And I wanted to talk about kind of the incentives in the current meta to play OTK decks and why it kind of works, why don't people play non-OTK? Why is OTK so prevalent? And I think I kind of thought about this video because I think Luna put out this Twitter post where she said, is it crazy that Hershima has almost circled back to the same decks a year ago? And I think it wasn't really a year ago. Its quest handlock hasn't been around that long. And OTK DH, I don't think is that good right now, but I think she has an interesting kind of perspective. A lot of people resonate with, why do these decks keep coming back? Why can't they've been nerfed over and over, especially lifesteal DH, over and over and over again, and it keeps coming back. And I want to say, I don't think lifesteal DH is very good right now. Monsanto had this pretty funny tweet where he said, guys, it's still good, trust. And if you can't quite see here, but he has like nothing but losses here. And is this Volga gun? Gameplay, finish quests, always be 1-2 measure clearing board. They board, play Kirchhoff when they have lethal on board. OTKDH is not very efficient right now. I don't think it's very good. Certain players who just love the deck will still play it, but I think it's a pretty bad deck right now. The win rate resists. I think there are better kind of high skill OTK decks, things like Mozaki Mage or Poison Rogue, which are a lot stronger in my opinion. But I think what's interesting about it is normally decks get nerfed. We look at Thief Rogue, for example. It's gotten nerfed, and it got a small nerf in retro, like compared to these other decks. I'm saying the actual nerf that it got compared to like Lifesteal DH, which has been nerfed dozens and dozens of times. Handlord like has been nerfed dozens and dozens of times, and Thief Rogue gets a 1 mana nerf on its 0 mana minion anyways, and 1 attack nerf, and Scabs, its hero, goes to 8 mana, and it's borderline unplayable. Why can these OTK decks survive where these sort of tempo or board decks just kind of are so sensitive to nerfs? And I kind of want to say is largely because the meta incentivizes OTKs. So I want to talk about, if we look at back in Forged of the Barons, what were people playing? There's a lot of Rush Warrior. Like, so at first there was Paladin and Mage, and those got nerfed really heavily. And then eventually you had, towards the end, you had like Rush Warrior, you had Priest, and it was just tons and tons of Priest. Like the Priest was so, and you kind of had a little bit of Mage, but Priest was everywhere. Priest was insanely popular. And kind of what was, and this is kind of, I think, what led to the United Stormwinds. But if you look at Priest, what was going on? Well, one, removal was insane. It was just, you had Hysteria, you had just Blademaster full Apotheosis, you had just, Priest had all these powerful ways to remove, but did not have, and here's the thing, people act like Priest didn't have a win condition. It did, it just didn't work very well because your opponents had ways to remove. So if you look at something like elemental shaman that came out in the middle. So let's go and find a kind of elemental shaman list, even though it's been updated. So this has new freeze cards, but if you look at kind of what were a lot of for a while, this is kind of similar. Priest would play, Shaman was kind of good against it, and they would play all these kind of cards. They didn't have Granite back then, but they would do things like Lilypad Lurker. They keep drawing cards, and they would, just keep removing anytime the Priest played something. So even though the Priest would remove all their threats, but they would remove all the threats. So it was really, really hard for anyone to ever get ahead on board, to get these powerful board states that they could use to win. Because reality is, this is my point number one. Removal is insane. Look at this Lily Pad Lurker card. I want you to see how good this Lily Pad Lurker card is. And the fact that it's not a meta-defining force, it shows you how much the meta has adjusted. It's a 5-mana 5/6 with a Hex, compared to a 4-mana Hex. Now, yes, you have to play Elementals, but that's so insane that you could take, like, it can be a 13-mana swing for 5 mana. Like, you do it on an 8-drop. And what does this incentivize? It says, don't play big minions because they're going to get hexed. And so many classes have this kind of stuff. They have these powerful removal, and almost every class has it. So let's go through. I'm going to go into the Hearthstone client, and we're going to look at some classes of how insane removal is right now. And I think this is one of the things that nobody talks about, how incredibly good, and everything got buffed, by the way, from like into the core set. Like every class has insane removal. So let's look at Mage. Devolving Missiles, an absolutely insane card. This is also in Shaman. It barely even gets run because the moment, because classes have already adjusted, they can often just randomly generate Devolving Missiles, but insanely strong card. The fact that it's not run as often because the meta has adjusted to it. Let's talk about other really strong removal cards. Fire Sale. Like, this is a board removal, but insanely good, and it's tradable. So you can have this card, and if your opponent doesn't play board decks, which they don't because board decks get wrecked, you just trade it away. So you have like just some really strong cards. Flame Strike used to do 4, now it does 5. So really strong stuff. Let's talk about Paladin. Paladin got its equality nerfed. Now it went back to 3, but then you get, if you're playing the Libran deck, you have what I thought originally was one of the most strong Libram cards. That probably is Libram of Justice. Change all minions to 1 health. Barely sees play. It doesn't even see play because what minions do you clear? Because nobody plays minions. All right. So I want you to see that you can see there's just absolutely insane removal. Barav, absolutely insane. Priest, oh god, Priest, the king of the removal. They got the Soul Mirror. They got the steals. They can steal your guy. If now they don't do that, they have now Hajak, they have Hysteria, if just such is Zarella, absolutely insane removal, and so many classes have this. I want you to see, so it's so hard for classes to get ahead on board. The moment a class decides to play defense on board, it's just very hard for a class. A class needs threat after threat after threat. And often the problem is there's board swings. So even if I'm playing Druid, for example, you might get a really head on board. If I'm playing Ramp Druid and then I play Yogg-Saron, and let's say I steal 3 minions, or let's say I eat all the minions. Well, now you have to deal with a 30 health minion often. And your deck might, if you're an aggro deck, you probably can't deal with that. And then I win the game. So what these cards and kind of what removal makes incentive is like, it's very hard to win on board, especially a class. We could go with Warlock. Let's talk about Warlock. Warlock's got Hysteria. It doesn't even see play. It's got Soul Rend. It's got the Touch. It's got the Blood Shark, which works super well. And it's even got its own Prize Plunderer now. We didn't even go into Prize Plunderer for Rogue, but it's got its own Shadowblade Slinger, which is its own Prize Plunderer. So what does this mean? Decks are really good at stopping opponents from winning on board. So what does this create the incentive to? Well, it says, okay, I have a really hard time winning on board. How do I win? I do an OTK from hand. I do burn from hand. Burn actually is the more common strategy, in my opinion, right now than pure OTK. So the best decks that are doing right now aren't pure OTK, they're hybrid OTK. So Poison Rogue is a deck that, uses burn, but also has a backup OTK. Burn Shaman doing really well right now, but it's kind of doing, Burn Shaman isn't, sometimes we'll get an OTK off. If you watch kind of my Burn Shaman video, I'm pretty sure there's at least one video where I get a full 30 damage OTK. But a lot of games, most games, you're kind of just fighting for board. Maybe you get them down to 10 health, and then you finish them off with the burn. Quest Warlock has kind of the OTK backup win condition of with the fatigue, but they're usually trying to win with board. So that tends to be the really strong strategy right now. I think it's the dominant strategy. Is kind of backup OTK, fighting for board a little bit, and burn. Burn tends to do really well. And so, because the reality is, it's really hard to win with minions in Hearthstone right now. Now, so it's just a thing of the game has such insane removal. So if you can't win with minions, but you just get a combo in your hand, and almost every hero class is a combo. I remember, why did this happen? Part of why did United Stormer get printed? If you look at Forge of the Barons, removal is so insane. What did you get? Lots and lots of 40-minute pre-smears. Now, I'm actually one of those weird people who likes 40-minute pre-smears, but I'm an exception to the rule. A lot of people don't like that. So there's this reality is, the problem is when you have insane defenses and you're forced to win with board. And why were you forced to win with board? One, OTK's Warrant is good in Forge of the Barons. It was for his lifesteal DH was probably the only one. And it was two, Elucia existed. So you could counter the OTKs with Elucia, making it so it was hard to win, harder to win because of Elucia. So you had that disruption. So bottom line is, what does this create? It says there's kind of always the kind of fastest, most efficient OTKs and how effectively they can stop aggro decks. So you have different kinds of the OTKs. So for example, Mizaki Mage is a OTK deck that's very, very fast, even at 4 encounters counter flow, and it actually does okay against kind of a board-based aggro, something like a Beast Druid or a Taunt Druid, because it has really, really good removal, but it gets completely wrecked by decks with burn. So a burn shaman, a face hunter. So that's kind of one of the OTKs. But if you look at that, compare that to something like LTK, LTK has a lot better removal. So it does quite well against like a face hunter. Let's take a look at LTK's stats real quick. So there's barely any. It's crazy how few people are playing LTK. That doesn't even show up in the main stats thing. But we go matchups. All right, let's go by class. Let's go with the LTK. 51% win rate, by the way. That's a solid win rate. So you can see LTK has a very, very good win rate against Face Hunter because it has heal, as really good board control tools. So it kind of compromises its OTK over like a really, really fast OTK deck like Mizaki Mage. But you can see it's a clear unfavor against Mizaki Mage. They are just going to lose the race the majority of the time against a Mizaki Mage. Sometimes they can pull it off, but most of the time they won't. And you can see LTK is kind of losing to other OTK decks and burn decks. So apparently it does okay against, but decks that just kind of go for the, especially burn, that don't play a lot of minions. Which this is actually, in my opinion, burn hybrid strategies are the most dominant, powerful forms of decks in what the meta incentivizes, because sort of the pure OTK has kind of been disincentivized, but the hybrid OTK is really good. But you can see it does really well against aggro. So you have a OTK deck that does really well against aggro with LTK. So where Mizaki is kind of a faster OTK, but it gets wrecked by a lot of aggro. But it does okay against things like Beast Druid, where Beast Druid and Aggro Druid don't have, they work on board a lot more. But what it really does is Mizaki Mage kind of wrecks these mid-range decks, sort of like Hand Warlock or Libra Paladin. I'd say, I'm guessing Mizaki actually has an even better win rate at the higher levels against Libra Paladin, yes. So, but the bottom line is you have different OTK decks, and they have different pass least resistances, but bottom line is the OTK incentive is still there of just like removal is really good. And but also remember, when I look at this and I see things like Poison Rogue, things like Aggro Elemental Shaman, Burn Shaman, things like Face Hunter, which is kind of a board hybrid burn. The burn hybrid decks, in my opinion, is the most dominant strategy. And that's reasonable. That's actually a reasonable thing of having some damage one way and maybe either an OTK or board. I think that's not so bad, and that's why I said I think this is still a good meta. It's got some things that I don't even consider problems. There are things that some people are going to like and some people aren't going to like. But bottom line, I kind of want to just, like I said, talk about there's just these really, really strong incentives to play OTK decks and play damage from hand because removal is so freaking good. So what would I like to see done about this? One is I think disruption can get sort of better, but I think we have the issue of that. That's kind of the easy answer. I'm just going to talk about that one first. We have Mutinous, and Mutinous is a good card, and it does well in this meta. It's a strong card in the current meta, in my opinion. Not every deck runs it like it was first week, but and let's see, it's not performing that well overall. It's kind of a marginal card in my opinion in a lot of decks, and so basically hand removal isn't very good, but board removal is insane. So what I would kind of like is the just overall power level of disruption to be a little bit stronger. So I'm not exactly sure. Disruption is kind of tricky, but when I see when winning with board is very, very difficult, but winning with your hand, your hand is very, very safe. I don't like that incentive. I think but that's thing number two. I'd like removal to be a little bit weaker. So that's very, very hard to do. The whole game is balanced around that, but a lot of things are rotating. And I think you could take certain removals out of the core set. You could make maybe removal less efficient. I think that's something you could do. But I think the real thing is the reality is the power creep and removal has kind of happened. The design philosophy has kind of happened. So what I would like is powerful minion cards being stronger. And I'm going to give some examples of cards, and I got one here I really like that I would like to see more of these cards. So one of my favorite cards is Wild Paw Cavern. It's summon 3/4s, 3s of freeze. You can see this isn't even one of the strongest cards in the Bullner OTK deck, but it's a card that is a lot of stats for 4 mana, and it's a very, very strong card in my opinion. And it's clunky stats, and I like clunky stats. I think clunky stats need to be more efficient. Death rattles need to be better. I'd like these kind of cards have more place in the meta, and it's hard to design them because clunky stats suck in Hearthstone right now. But I want it to be a thing, if you look at things like Galakrond Shaman or back in the Descended Dragons, I like when big boards are happening, when powerful boards are happening, when decks have powerful board things. And I think when you have mana cheating on board, it's not nearly as bad. Your opponent can play a 9 mana Clowns and you could still win. Your opponent can make a 30-30 minion and you could figure out a way to kill it. But if your opponent OTKs you, there's no way to do it. So I like that intermediate step. So I think I much prefer powerful boards. And I even think Wild Paw Null put an interesting effect on the meta. Now, I think it did crowd out a lot of other strategies. I still think overall is a good nerf. But what was interesting about Wild Paw Null is when you have a card like Wild Paw Null, it puts a lot of minion stats early on in the game. And I think while one, it is still too strong, I would like cards that are efficient stats early or efficient stats maybe in the mid game. So another card I think I like from this set are kind of 0 mana minions that you have to kind of make. And this is one of the things with Beast Druid, and this is why Beast Druid is still a really good deck, even though it's still it's not as popular. But things like Frost Saver Matriarch and Owl, I think, are really cool cards where they eventually cost 0, so you can play them really efficiently. Then you have to do some stuff, but it's not a thing of, and you can kind of hold them back. So what I like about cards like this is they can really make board presence more interesting. So what the problem is, if you have like a bunch of clunky 8 mana minions, well, you only can play 1 per turn. Your opponent does a board swing, something like Scabs or something like a Soul Mirror. And the problem is now you're playing from behind and the control deck can keep winning. But when you have something like this, well, let's say your opponent's going to do a big removal turn. Now with Scab's a little different because these are 0 mana, but you can often hold stuff back, force out the removal, force out the brawl, and then redevelop. So I actually really like, I think people talk about mana cheating like it's really bad. I don't like mana cheating in certain ways, but I think minion cheating effectively can actually, I think, have a good effect on the game. So I'd like basically minions and sort of board effects to be more powerful. I'd like relative to the other things. I think that's a big thing. I'd like minions on board, effects on board to be stronger. And I think I'd like burned to be less the primary way of winning. As opposed. So I think that's something that some of this stuff I think is a really good time for the next expansion, the core set, to analyze. So if you're a dev and you're watching this, and this is kind of just my thoughts. I haven't, I don't have all the answers. A lot of these things I want to say there's so many moving parts. So despite what some people say, there aren't these clear, easy, like just do this and the meta will be perfect. I really don't like when people have this, oh, if the devs just stop printing mana cheating, the meta would be perfect. No, like it's not that simple. It's much more complicated than that. But that being said, like I'm trying to say what the direction, like I said, more powerful minions on board effect, especially without charge and without rush. I think that's a big thing I'd like to see. Powerful minions on board that don't necessarily have instant effects. 2, I'd like to see removal get weaker, and 3, I'd like the power of disruption. Now, Lucia was a very unpopular card. A lot of people liked her, a lot of people hated her. But she was if you look at her power level in the world of disruption, she was so much higher than other cards. So it's a thing of, finding the right power level of disruption. But I definitely think there's when you can kind of have all this value and sort of power stored in your hand that can be used for the other things like Lightning Blooms, things like these combos. When there's not really, like, that's what the meta is incentivizing, and sort of disruption can disincentivize that and make it more accessible to win with board. But that being said, if you had a powerful disruption, what often might happen? Well, it just switches from OTK to burn. Because if you have a giant weapon, well, Lucy doesn't really do anything on that. If you're playing individual burn cards, as opposed to maybe big combos, it's not as effective. But still, some of that disruption can force out suboptimal plays. But I think the point is we don't necessarily want the priest hyper defensive meta, but at the same time we don't want necessarily the meta of hyper aggro. So I want to talk real quickly about why I really like Ramp Druid in this video. I might make a whole video on this, but why I think Ramp Druid, despite it's tier 3 deck, why it can kind of do well in kind of the sort of current meta, even though it's not top tier. And I think the big reason and what I like why it's kind of more resilient to removal is that it has a way to gain tempo without board. So when board's really, really good, the problem is if you play anything, it just gets removed. So it's very hard for certain classes to gain a tempo, to sort of keep up with the tempo. So opponents playing minions, you're playing something like a rogue, for example, and you try and fight back for board. Well, the problem is they will, like, if you try and play minions on board and fight for board, they'll just get an insane prize plunder. So if you play clunky stats, it just doesn't really work. But if you ramp up and you can go like overgrowth into guff, and you can gain kind of all this delayed tempo. And I think also things like armor is a way that you can sort of gain tempo without minions, because the reality is if you put an 8-drop on board against scabs, well, it just gets put back in your deck. But if you gain 16 armor, that's a thing that is a little more resilient. So another thing I'd like is more classes to have ways to gain tempo that aren't just playing minions or drawing cards. I think Druid's a good one. One way I'd like to see for Priest is I'd like Priest to be able to heal higher somehow. I think it'd be interesting if Priest started with maximum 50 life but started at 30. So Priest could immediately start hero powering their face, kind of like Warrior gets a hero power. I think that could be an interesting Maybe you have some sort of, if your deck doesn't contain any shadow spells, raise your max health to 30. There could be stuff like that. There could be incentives for Priest to be able to gain tempo without this. So that's another thing I'd like the game to have. So I might do more videos on that, but that's kind of, so one, like I said, these are just my thoughts and I'm kind of just rambling on stuff. But one, let's go. One, let's talk about removals insane. Let's talk about what the OTK that one, removals insanely good, and two, it's hard to get ahead on board with minions because removal is so insanely good. So what is the path of least resistance to win? Burn and OTKs. So what would I like to this? One, I'd like slightly stronger disruption. I like clunky minion plays to be better. Things like Wild Paul Knoll Caverns, I think is or Wild Paul Caverns. I'm blanking. But yeah, things like that where you have lots and lots of stats for a cheap amount of money, cheap amount of mana, but clunky stats, slow stats. I think I really like the Wild Paul Caverns because of that. So more stats, and this is kind of a test on that. I was talking to a Wet Goose, and he said, if I just keep playing minions on board, an OTK deck shouldn't be able to remove them consistently, but they kind of can. So it's just a thing of just the fact that you could just play minion after minion after minion, and the OTK deck could just keep removing after removing after removing and still have the OTK. There's not enough of a compromise where it's like, well, in order to have the OTK, they kind of have to have some bad cards and sometimes just get run over. So, because in theory, what would happen is, let's say, you're getting run over as OTK decks. So then these board decks get more popular because they're running over the OTK decks. And then what would happen is more a control mid-rangey defensive style come up. So then to beat that kind of powerful mid-range pressure, maybe sort of a greedier, like it has better removal, maybe has more other powerful threats, and then that would incentivize the anti-combo. So we already have that a little bit, but I think it's just sort of out of sort of the power level is this. So make it so, like I said, minion pressure is better, removal is slightly worse, disruption slightly better. That's kind of the big things I would like. So I'd like the path of least resistance not to be OTK and burn, but playing minions on board. I think that would be, when minions are best. What is Hearthstone really great about Hearthstone compared to other card games? It's the board. It's the interaction on board. Board is where we interact. Board, when my opponent makes a 12-12 Edwin, they can fight back. You have a game where they make a 12-12 Edwin and you pull off a win, and it feels great. It feels great. But when your opponent just OTKs you, there doesn't feel like you could do, especially when you know the OTK is coming, when they've all set it up and there's no play you can do to stop them because disruption is not strong enough. But, if you watch my stream, a lot of times, we have games where we're playing against the Thief Rogue pre-nerf, and our opponent would get 2 Wild Paw Knolls, and we'd pull off a sick win. It's very satisfying. And, so if there is something strong, I'd like the strong broken thing to be minions on board. So that's kind of my opinion on that. I think the next expansion and the rotating the core set is a great opportunity to kind of shift the meta incentives to say minions on board. So if you're a designer on the dev team and you're watching this video, you're welcome. So anyways, I hope you guys like this type of video and kind of me talking my thoughts. If you have sort of a criticism or a nuance, feel free to share it in the chat about what you think about the incentives, and try to stay away from the everything simple. If the devs just stop doing this, things are complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. Let's not pretend this is easy. Making a great meta and a great this is very difficult. So if you're going to do criticism, try to have the mindset of this is not easy and not everyone's going to get what they want. But try to have actual sort of feedback that you think, try to think about it. Just try not to have simple, it's easy, because it's not. Anyways, hope you guys like this and enjoy.